Hi guys, James at Rampant Lion Reviews again for you today with another beer review. For this one we're going to head over to the state of New York in America, and we're going to have a taste of another beer from one of the very first American craft breweries that I ever encountered. So we're going to go to Brooklyn Brewery, but today we're going to have a taste of their Post Road, which is a pumpkin ale, and it's the very first pumpkin ale that I've ever reviewed for you on here, so it should be quite an interesting one. But I actually found this in my box. I forgot I had this one, so it's about time that I get round to reviewing it because it goes out of date in just a couple of weeks actually. So let's get this guy reviewed. But anyway, as is usual with my beer reviews then, I'll take you through a very brief history of the brewery. It will only be a minute or two long because I've done a few Brooklyn reviews for you before. If you do want to get straight to the tasting, just fast forward. The brewery website's in the video description for you below, along with a link to my other Brooklyn reviews I've done for you before, and they do have quite a few other beers that I'm still to review as well, so I'm sure I'll add to that in the very near future. But anyway, the founder of the Brooklyn Brewery is Steve Hindy, who was actually an Associated Press correspondent, and in 1984 he returned to the US from a 6-year stint in the Middle East, and he settled in Brooklyn's Park Slope neighbourhood. But while in the Middle East, Steve had become interested in homebrewing after meeting many of the diplomats who brewed their own beers in countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, where alcohol obviously is forbidden due to the Islamic law. But with his downstairs neighbour Tom Potter, Steve decided to quit his job and he founded the Brooklyn Brewery, and they commissioned fourth-generation German-American brewer William H. Moeller to develop the recipe for Brooklyn Lager, which was made in Utica up in New York. And they had to do this because of their limited resources, so they sort of contract brewed in a way. But Moeller's grandfather had actually brewed beer in Brooklyn many years previously, and he had left his brewing books in the family, and so this was just passed on as a family heirloom, if you like. But it was very difficult for Hindy and Potter in the early days of the brewery. They found that many New York distributors were controlled by the big breweries, and they weren't interested in the smaller brands. And they also hired Milton Glaser, who's known for the I Love New York logo, to design their bottle art and the brewery logo that they're now famous for. But after advice from Sophia Collier, who was the founder of Soho Natural Soda, the pair bought a van and a beverage truck and actually began peddling the beer from store to store on their own. And this is how they gained such quite a well-known reputation these days. But back then, crime was very high in New York, and Hindy and Potter faced burglars, armed robbers and mob-connected people who wanted a piece of the brewery for themselves. But New York taverns were also sceptical of the beer because the price of the Brooklyn beer was almost the same as a lot of the import beers, and it really just wasn't very well known. But in 1994, the company hired respected New York brewmaster Garrett Olivier to design and plan their Brooklyn brewery and to oversee the production up in Utica. So Garrett is also the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Companion to Beer, and he authored the book entitled The Brewmaster's Table, and the new brewing facility was opened in 1996 by Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who also poured the first official glass of beer, the Brooklyn Vice. And since then Garrett has developed many award-winning recipes, and the brewery does have quite an extensive repertoire of beers. But in 2003 the partners decided that the company had grown to the volume where they could be a big client on the books of a distributor. So Tom and Steve sold their distribution division to two large New York wholesalers who'd actually rejected them 15 years previously, and this was Phoenix Beehive Distributors. And at this point, Tom, who had been running the distribution business for 15 years, sold his share in the brewery to David Ottaway, who was a good friend of Steve and had actually been an early investor in the brewery project. But Tom now runs a distillery called the New York Distilling Company, which is in Williamsburg in New York State. Now, David's son Eric and Robin had run the Boston distribution for Brooklyn, and the Ottaway family actually did have roots in the Brooklyn area of New York. Their grandfather, who was General John Blackburn Woodward, had unsuccessfully stood for the mayor of Brooklyn in 1885, and he was the board president of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. And Eric is now the brewery general marshal, while Robin is the sales manager. But today the brewery are apparently overseeing a major expansion that will double their capacity. I believe this is still going on actually, and this is with the creation of the Rolek Brewhouse, and they hope that this will allow Garrett and his team to produce many new beers, and they are actually starting to do that now. I've seen Irish Dry Stout and all of these things, but apparently the first of these experimental beers was a saison which was called Brooklyn Radius, and it was only released in the district of Brooklyn. But nowadays their beers are available in 25 states and over 20 countries worldwide, and 2013 was in fact their 25th anniversary, and they released a special beer with which they celebrated that. And this was a special version of the Brooklyn Lager, which was introduced introduced in 1988. So anyway, that's your kind of brief history of the Brooklyn Brewery. Just to list a few of the other beers you can get from these guys. So in their perennial range, which is kind of like their core range, they have the Brooklyn Lager, the Brooklyn Brown Ale, which is one of my favourite beers actually, the East India Pale Ale, the Pilsner, Pennant Ale, and also Brooklyn Blast. And in their seasonals, they've got the Black Chocolate Stout, the Winter Ale, which is actually very, very nice, Monster Ale, Dry Irish Stout, Summer Ale, Oktoberfest, and they've also got this guy, the Post Road Pumpkin Ale. And they've also got a range of big bottles as well. As I say, just check out the brewery website and you'll get an idea of the various different beers that they produce. But anyway, let's get on to the tasting of this guy itself. So this one is a 5% specialty beer. This is their kind of autumn Halloween kind of release, so it's 5% alcohol, and it's described as being a colonial style pumpkin ale. And apparently the colonial brewers in early colonial America found pumpkins to be very flavourful ingredients when they were put into brews. So this is just the idea behind this beer is that it captures this kind of old and lost style. So the malts in this one are American Turo, British Crystal, Belgian Biscuit and aromatic malts, and it's hopped with Willamette and American Fuggles hops, and it also contains Dickinson's pumpkins and nutmeg. So I'll just let you have a little quick look at the artwork and then we'll get this guy open. So as you can see, just bring the light over so you can see it a little bit better. It's actually got quite a nice label on it, but they've actually changed the label of this one for the new year coming, and I believe it's going to look more like the kind of typical Brooklyn Lager and the other ones. It's got the typical kind of Brooklyn symbol, the sort of roundel in the middle of it, but this is the older label actually, but the beer is still good. It goes out of date in about a month's time apparently, but you can see it's got a different bottle cap on it as well, so quite glad that I still have the old bottle and can keep the bottle cap. So it says on the side here, in the 18th century, colonial Americans brewed wonderful and interesting ales by using local ingredients. Pumpkins were favoured by brewers for their rich, spicy flavours, which melded perfectly with malted barley. Brooklyn Brewery gives you Post Road Pumpkin Ale, a delicious rendition of this New England classic. So it should be a pretty nice beer for us to review. So let's crack it open and get on with the tasting here. So as you can see, a nice smoky opening there, and this is actually the very first time that I'm trying a pumpkin ale, and you can really smell the sort of spicy character of this one as you pour it out actually. But you can see it's poured a very nice kind of dark, how would you describe it, a dark sort of caramelly amber colour. There's a good bit of sedimentation in there floating about, some kind of medium-sized particles, but you can see there's a kind of a finger of a frothy, slightly off-white kind of creamy coloured head. It isn't transparent, it is quite hazy. If I put my fingers behind it you can't see through it, but there's a good little bit of sediment particles in there, and that's probably just because I've had it in the fridge for about a week or so, but it looks very, very nice. And I would say the colour is probably a kind of dark caramelly amber colour. It looks very, very nice. There's a good bit of carbonation visible in this, some bigger bubbles just going up towards the bottom of the head, and you can see some of the smaller bubbles in there too. So let's give this guy a smell and see how we get on. So yeah, as you would expect, it's got a big kind of spicy bready aroma to it. This is one thing I'd heard about this beer, is that it was quite interesting, mainly for the bready and sort of spicy nutmeggy character you would get in it. So you've got a really nice kind of sweet caramel that underpins it actually. So a big spicy bready profile in this one. The nutmeg definitely comes out, and you can maybe get a little bit of cinnamon in there too. But there's a good kind of sweet caramel just underpinning that. It comes out especially when you sugar it up a little bit. And you can get the pumpkin in there too. The pumpkin kind of underpins the whole aroma of the beer. So mainly it's a big malty beer, this one. You can smell a little bit of this kind of ashy character to it as well, and that's typical of the sort of Fuggles hops, but it smells very, very nice. So a typical big bready kind of spicy character from this one, which is exactly what you would expect. I've never tried a pumpkin ale, but I've been told that it's really a big kind of spicy aroma that you want to try from these ones. So yeah, without further ado, let's get stuck in. So this is the Post Road Pumpkin Ale from Brooklyn Brewery in Brooklyn in New York City. Slange it. And that's really quite nice actually. It's very, first impression of it is that it's a very, very smooth beer. Big, kind of big bready malt base, as I was saying you would expect from this. But yeah, it's actually, I'm finding it kind of really quite smooth, I would say. Really kind of nice big bready malt base to this one, and it's got a nice spicy character too. You've got a little bit of kind of cinnamon, maybe a wee bit of ginger and sort of nut, and you can pick up the nutmeg as well. It's probably the nutmeg that's giving it a kind of big bready feel. And on the tongue, you can really just pick that up. It's really quite beautifully done, actually. Yeah. You get the pumpkin. The pumpkin is just a kind of mild underlying flavour on this one. I think it's almost just like a kind of big bready golden ale, if that makes sense. Then you've got this pumpkin flavour that sort of builds in the aftertaste. I'm getting it right in the kind of back corners of the palate, just before you get to the edge of the tongue. You can feel this kind of pumpkin flavour just build up, and I know what I really enjoy actually eating pumpkin. In Taiwan, when I was over there, they ate a lot of pumpkin and a lot of sweet potato and things, so I know what the pumpkin flavour's like. And what's interesting about this is just how it builds in the back of the palate as the aftertaste kind of comes in. But yeah, there's a good bit of sweetness in there too. The caramel flavour goes right down the middle of the tongue there, and it sort of builds in the aftertaste too. But the pumpkin that just kind of builds up in flavour it's a really nice touch, actually. I wasn't really sure what to expect from this one, if the pumpkin would be very forward, but it's more like a kind of speciality sort of spiced ale, this one, really. But yeah, it's actually got quite a kind of grassy hop around the edge of this one. It's very mild and very smooth. It's not very kind of florally and aromatic and sharp in some way that these can be. That's what you usually expect from the Williamette hop, from what I can remember. It's mainly a kind of nice, smooth, grassy hop. And the Fugels hop, I don't know how American Fugels differs from English Fugels, but English Fugels usually gives you a kind of spicy character to it as well, sort of earthy spice, maybe a little bit of an ashy flavour, but I'm not really picking up an ashy characteristic of this one. There is perhaps a little bit of earthy character in the very back corners of the palate there, and that kind of blends well with this sort of spicy bready malt base that just blankets the centre of the palate. You get this nutmeg. It's usually when you get a spicy beer like this, the sort of rye flavours sit just in the middle of the palate and things, but because it's nutmeg and cinnamon and ginger, that really blends in with this bready blanket. But it's quite a sweet spiciness, if that makes sense. It just blends together really well, this beer, and that kind of spicy character makes the transition between the earthy hop and the kind of smooth grassiness. It makes it go very, very smoothly indeed, and it works very, very well. But yeah, it's a very interesting beer, actually. The pumpkin flavour just kind of underpins the whole thing, so it's not too in your face, and it just gives the beer a kind of unusual but very, very nice taste. And the kind of pumpkin-y sweetness that you get from it blends again very well with that kind of spicy nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon sort of flavour that goes in this beer. But in terms of the mouthfeel of this one, it's a mid-bodied beer, definitely that. The carbonation is quite smooth, and it's actually quite oily, but that suits the nutmeggy flavours and also the pumpkin too, I think. But you've got a nice malty sweetness in there and a good spicy character too, like I was saying. You have a little bit of dry character around the front of the tongue there. It's a kind of grassy, slightly grassy, but a smooth grassiness, if that makes sense, just around the edges of the tongue. And you do pick up, as you move into the aftertaste, a kind of very dry, and well, not very dry, kind of smooth, dry, grassy character in this, but the spicy character isn't dry at all. The middle of the palate there is very smooth and quite moist, actually. So overall, it's a very interesting beer. My first taste of a pumpkin ale has actually been quite nice, and I think that the reason that it works so well is because it's quite subtle and the flavours blend together so well. So if you do get a chance, give the Post Road beer a go. I'm not sure if they'll have changed the recipe with changing the label slightly, but I think this is a really, really good beer, and definitely quite quirky and quite interesting, so it is worth checking out. And I'm sure most of the beers from, or pretty much all of them from Brooklyn Brewery in fact, are very good, so I'm sure if you haven't tried any of these before, you can just pick one that you like, a particular style, and you won't be disappointed by it, I'm sure. But this is a very nice one, quite quirky, and I would recommend that you try it. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this beer review. It's been cool to return to the Brooklyn Brewery after about 200 videos or so. I think it's been a long time since I've reviewed one of their beers, but this one's been really cool to do for you, so I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments section below, as always, if you've tried this beer before. I always like hearing other people's thoughts on the beer, and please like, subscribe, share, all the usual YouTube stuff, and in the meantime I'll catch you soon with my next beer review. Slàinte for now.